December 16th, 1944. Before dawn, the Ardennes forest, a sector deemed quiet, exploded. 29 German divisions, 250,000 men, 1,000 tanks surged forward. They slammed into lightly defended American lines, ripping a vast, bloody hole. Muzzle flashes ripped the pre-dawn darkness, followed by the deafening thunder of 1,000 German guns. Temperatures plummeted below freezing, turning breath to ice, but the air was thick with the reek of cordite and fear. Chaos erupted, a tide of steel and desperation. The Wehrmacht's commanders, confident in their impossible feat, believed they had shattered the Allied front, leaving only one question: could anyone stop this final, brutal gamble? The Allied advance had been relentless. After the D-Day landings and the brutal fighting in Normandy, the Western Front was pushing inexorably eastward, closing in on Germany's industrial heartland, the Saar region. Victory seemed almost within reach, a matter of time and attrition. But in the shadowed bunkers of the Third Reich, a desperate, final gamble was being meticulously planned by Adolf Hitler himself. Operation Watch on the Rhine was not merely a counteroffensive. It was a Hail Mary pass, a delusional attempt to rewrite the war's narrative. Hitler envisioned a lightning strike, a massive armored thrust through the dense, snow-laden Ardennes forest, a region dismissed by Allied command as impassable for large-scale operations. The objective? Drive 60 miles deep into Belgium and Luxembourg, seize the vital port of Antwerp, and thereby split the British and American forces, isolating entire armies. A shocking victory, he believed, could force a separate peace with the Western Allies, buying precious time to confront the Soviet juggernaut in the east. 3 German armies, comprising 250,000 troops and 1,000 tanks, were moved into position under the cloak of winter darkness and absolute radio silence. Allied intelligence, lulled by their relentless eastward progress and an over-reliance on their decrypting capabilities, failed catastrophically to detect this monumental buildup. They saw only fragmented units, minor skirmishes, and the familiar German retreat. The Western Front, complacent in its presumed victory, was walking blindly into a trap of catastrophic proportions. How could such a massive, audacious plan remain completely hidden from the watchful eyes of the most sophisticated intelligence networks the world had ever known? The cold, hard truth of the Ardennes disaster converged in Verdun on December 19, 1944. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, faced a catastrophe. The American First Army, battered and broken by the sudden German onslaught, was in disarray, its units fragmented, its command structure fracturing under the immense pressure. Maps were spread, littered with red arrows of German advance, pointing ominously towards Antwerp. The room was thick with despair, with generals proposing cautious retreats, attempting to stem the bleeding, to simply hold the line. Then, a voice cut through the gloom. Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr., a man forged in the crucible of North Africa and Sicily, a general whose very name evoked both controversy and audacious victories, stood before his peers. 59 years old, with a reputation as fiery as his pearl-handled revolvers, Patton commanded the Third Army, a formidable force of over 250,000 men and hundreds of tanks, currently engaged in fierce fighting 100 miles to the south. His proposal was met with stunned silence, then incredulity. He offered not a defensive posture, but a counterattack. A rapid 90-degree pivot of 6 full divisions, a 100-mile march through freezing winter conditions to strike the German flank. This was not merely difficult, it was considered militarily impossible. German forces had already driven 20 miles deep into Belgium, consolidating their gains. To disengage, move, and re-engage with such speed was unheard of. Yet Patton, a lifelong student of Napoleon, Alexander, and Caesar, had already anticipated this moment, preparing his men and his logistics for such a contingency. While others debated the enormity of the task, Patton had already begun issuing preliminary orders. He had even instructed his chaplain, Colonel James Hugh O'Neill, to compose a prayer for clear weather, a seemingly trivial detail amidst the chaos, but one that spoke volumes about his singular, almost mystical focus. Could this maverick general, with his almost delusional self-belief, truly pull off what his peers deemed an act of madness? Or would his audacious gamble lead only to further American heartbreak? December 22nd, 1944. The Ardennes was a frozen hell. Patton's order, delivered with characteristic brevity, "Play ball!" unleashed his Third Army. 3 divisions, over 80,000 men pivoted north, driving directly into the heart of the blizzard. The ground, already iron-hard with frost, was now buried under fresh snow, temperatures plummeting to -7 degrees Celsius. Yet the colossal logistical machine roared to life. 133,000 vehicles, a seemingly endless convoy of trucks, half-tracks, and tanks, churned through the whiteout, hauling 62,000 tons of vital supplies. Every mile was a battle against the elements, against exhaustion, against the very notion of what was achievable in such conditions. Along a 20-mile front, the American assault crashed headlong into the German flank. Sherman tanks, their engines screaming defiance against the biting wind, led the charge, supported by determined infantry. This was not a cautious probe. It was a bludgeon. The Germans, still reeling from the surprise of their own offensive, were now met with an equal, if not greater, shock. Explosions ripped through the snow-laden forests, illuminating fleeting, brutal vignettes of close-quarters combat. Pushing through machine gun nests and anti-tank defenses, the American forces carved a bloody 7-mile corridor into enemy territory on that first brutal day. A remarkable feat. Yet the narrow passage they had opened, barely 500 yards wide, was a tenuous lifeline, vulnerable to counterattack from 3 sides. Patton, ever the pragmatist, had already instructed his chaplain to appeal for divine intervention, a prayer for clear skies. But could a mere prayer, or even the sheer will of one general, sustain such a perilous, audacious thrust against a desperate enemy entrenched in the depths of winter? Then a miracle, or perhaps a divine answer to Patton's audacious prayer. On December 23rd, the impenetrable cloud cover which had shielded the German advance and grounded Allied air superiority for days began to lift. The skies cracked open, revealing a world blanketed in pristine white snow, now vulnerable to the wrath from above. Swarms of Allied fighter bombers, held in check for days, descended like avenging angels. They tore into German columns, strafing tanks and trucks, decimating infantry caught in the open. The German fuel reserves, already perilously low, designed for a swift, overwhelming blitzkrieg, were now critically exposed. They had only enough for 6 days of operations, and the clock was ticking mercilessly. 3 days later, on December 26th, the breakthrough came. In the swirling snow and bitter cold, elements of the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion, under the fearless leadership of Lieutenant Charles Bogus, crashed through the battered German lines. Their objective? The beleaguered town of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division had been surrounded for days, defiantly holding out against impossible odds. The sight of the American tanks, their barrels spitting fire, was met with a roar of relief from the paratroopers. When German demands for surrender had reached Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe days earlier, his legendary one-word reply, "nuts," had encapsulated the American spirit of unyielding defiance. Now, that defiance was rewarded. The bulge in the Allied lines had been pierced. Patton, ever the master of the dramatic, turned to General Bradley with a grim satisfaction. This time, the Kraut stuck his head in the meat grinder, and I've got hold of the handle. The momentum, once firmly with the Wehrmacht, had irrevocably shifted. But while the relief was palpable, the price of victory remained steep. Could this fragile lifeline hold? And what fresh horrors awaited in the snow-choked forests as the battle for the Ardennes entered its next, brutal phase? The relief at Bastogne was a fleeting moment in a prolonged, brutal struggle. The Bulge had been breached, but not yet undone. For 6 more weeks, the Ardennes remained a charnel house, a vast, frozen battlefield where every inch of ground was contested with savage ferocity. The piercing cold became an enemy as deadly as any bullet. Soldiers clawed foxholes from earth as hard as concrete, their fingers numb, their breath fogging in the sub-zero air. Weapons caked with ice and snow seized up, their mechanisms betraying the men who wielded them. Men huddled together in desperate attempts to share body warmth, their very survival dependent on the proximity of another human being. The forests, once silent and serene, echoed with the constant crackle of rifle fire, the shriek of artillery, and the guttural cries of men locked in primordial combat. The pristine white snow, a deceptive shroud of peace, quickly became stained, turning red with the casualties of thousands of soldiers from both armies. Every attack, every counterattack extracted a terrible toll. This was a war of attrition, fought not just against an enemy, but against the elements themselves. Finally, on January 16, 1945, American forces pushing from the north and the south converged at Uffalize, a small Belgian town. The pincer closed. The Bulge was eliminated. The land was scarred, the trees splintered, and the silence that followed was heavy with the weight of unimaginable loss. But what had this monumental effort truly cost, and what had it ultimately achieved beyond mere survival? The smoke cleared, revealing the stark strategic consequences of the Ardennes inferno. Hitler's desperate gamble had utterly failed, and in doing so had devoured Germany's last strategic reserves. The Third Reich, already bleeding on 2 fronts, could ill afford the price. Casualties for the Wehrmacht exceeded 100,000 men. Over 700 tanks and 1,600 aircraft, precious resources that could never be replaced, were left as shattered monuments in the snow. This was not merely a defeat. It was a mortal wound, draining the last vestiges of offensive capability from the German war machine on the Western Front. For the Allies, particularly the Americans, the Battle of the Bulge served as a brutal yet transformative crucible. The American forces, which had entered the war as a relatively inexperienced, though formidable power, emerged from the Ardennes as a seasoned, professional military. They had weathered the storm, absorbed a devastating blow, and delivered a crushing counterpunch. German generals like Erich Brandenberger and Gab Blumentritt later spoke with grudging admiration for Patton's swift, aggressive, and highly mobile warfare, conceding that his operations closely mirrored their own classical military concepts. The initial shock of the German offensive had given way to a profound validation of Allied tenacity and strategic flexibility. The path to the heart of Germany, once temporarily obscured by the Bulge, now lay open and undefended, leading inexorably towards Berlin. But how would the exhausted armies, having just endured the coldest winter in recent memory, muster the strength for the final decisive push? Decades have passed since the last shots echoed through the snow-laden forests of the Ardennes, yet the Battle of the Bulge remains etched in the annals of history, a stark testament to courage, desperation, and the brutal efficacy of war. Winston Churchill, a man who had witnessed the full spectrum of global conflict, would later declare it undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war. It was more than a victory. It was a defining moment, a crucible that forged the modern American military, hardening its resolve and proving its mettle against a desperate, formidable foe. For Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr., the Ardennes was the ultimate vindication of a life spent preparing for war. He saw his role as almost preordained, confiding to his wife, "Destiny sent for me in a hurry when things got tight. Perhaps God saved me for this effort." It was the culmination of his audacious leadership, his relentless drive, and his unwavering belief in the fighting spirit of his men. The Third Army's epic pivot and counterattack transformed Hitler's last gasp into a catastrophic drain on the Wehrmacht's dwindling resources. The grim, unforgiving truth of the Ardennes lay not just in the strategic outcome, but in the human cost. The winter fields, once pristine, were stained not just with American sacrifice, but overwhelmingly with German blood. It was the German war machine that was finally and irrevocably broken, its last reserves of men and material squandered in a delusional gamble. The Bulge marked the point of no return for the Third Reich. The American forces, having faced annihilation and emerged victorious, found their finest hour in the crucible of winter warfare. But what profound lessons, beyond the triumph of arms, did this desperate struggle impart about the nature of human endurance and the true cost of freedom? Patton's audacious maneuver, executed against all odds, transformed Hitler's desperate gamble into a crushing defeat. His leadership, a blend of military genius and sheer force of will, not only broke the German assault but galvanized Allied resolve. It was a testament to the fighting spirit of American forces, achieving what many deemed impossible in the depths of winter. As Georgie himself might have said, "This was our finest hour." An hour forged in snow and blood, forever changing the course of the war. If you found this journey into history compelling, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the pivotal moments that shaped our world.